I'd like to just got the honour of introducing now Stephen Jolly. Stephen Jolly is a councillor from the city of Yarra. He, from memory, he was one of the first socialist councillor to be elected in many, many years. Steve, we've done a lot of work around exposing the absolute killing fields of the Victorian mental health system, and certainly we had no support from anybody. But as soon as we asked Steve Jolly, he was there, the first, straight away. He never queried what we're on about, apart from general briefing, and absolutely is so solid in everything he does. But also I work extensively with advocating for people with mental health issues, the hardest people in Melbourne, and people experiencing homelessness or both. And what I've heard from the communities that Steve works in, he's probably the only elected person, apart from what Sue's going to be like, and sorry, Colleen Hartman, who's just also amazing in supporting us. But generally I'd say one of the few elected people, and we hope Steve start standing for a Victorian government, if not federal government, and probably get it, I won't say that. But Steve's just an amazing guy. He actually practices what he preaches, and one of the few people that matches their rhetoric with real actions that make real differences in people's lives. Steve, thank you.
Brothers and sisters, comrades, thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. I'll be brief. It's 39 degrees heat. I'm working on a CFMU building site in Maribyrnong. We were all knocked off at 35 degrees. The big macho soldier building workers in Melbourne can't work past 35. It's an absolute credit to everyone who's always said before they come out at 39 degrees. But it's also an absolute scandal that we have to come out here on a hot day on a Saturday afternoon to talk about homelessness, the crisis in public housing, in a continent that's half empty, in a situation where tonight in Melbourne, at least 100 young people will be living on the streets. We've got a situation where, according to the latest Australian Bureau of Statistics, there's 1 million homes in Australia that are unoccupied. That's not including unoccupied office and housing properties. And they're unoccupied because it's more money for the owners to speculate, thanks to the write-offs, thanks to the tax concessions of the federal government. It's actually quite telling that in the last, for the $1.5 billion that the federal government have put into public housing, they've actually spent $50 billion on concessions, on the land tax, on negative gearing and other types of concessions for property developers. For many, many years in the 50s and in the 60s and the 70s, the right to housing, and it is a basic human right as much as health and education, was part and parcel of the struggle of the trade union movement, even of the Labour Party when it used to be a Labour Party, of the socialists and the communists in this country, the anarchists, and everybody left of centre. Housing was considered to be a basic human right. And it's no coincidence that in the 50s and 60s, with a stronger trade union movement, with the Labour Party better then, than at least a little bit than it is now, and a stronger workers' movement, that we saw the development of public housing to about 13% of public housing stock. And we have to say that public housing, for all its faults, for all the cuts, the great thing about public housing is that it was a product of struggle. It was a product of struggle of generations before us. It wasn't handed to us on a plate by the powers that be. But unfortunately, as we all know, it's not us that are running the country. Since the 70s, since the 80s, with this neoliberal agenda worldwide and in Australia, the capitalists have tried to wound back through their politicians public housing. They think it needs to be wound back. It's now down to about 2% of public housing stock in this country. And those of you who are public housing tenants here today will know what that means in practice. First and foremost, maintenance is put down as a final priority. So when tenants say that the light bulb isn't working in the hallway, that the laundry isn't working, that the cooker's not working, that the kitchen is damp, the maintenance has been centralised to Gippsland, the call centre. You don't have a situation where there's a tradesperson on site that knows the estate like it used to be. You have to wait sometimes weeks, if not months, for the basic maintenance to be fixed. The other thing that they're knocking back on, obviously, is housing stock. As I said before, apart from a slight little upsurge with the Rudd economic stimulus, for the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a gradual winding down of housing stock in Australia at the present moment in time. Any organisation like the VPTA, like Agra on the Fitzroy estate, they've got a choice. You either become a stooge for the minister of the day, whether that's Richard Wynne or Wendy Lovell, or you get defunded. That's the reality of it. And that is why it's been so hard for public housing tenants to organise, because they've been given that. Some have taken the stooge road, and that's a road to obscurity, and that's a road to being vomited out of public housing confidence from the tenants. And some have taken the road of struggle, like many of you, obviously all of you here today. The other thing that they're trying to do, obviously, is move from public housing to community housing. We all know that that means higher rents. We all know that that means a lack of tenure to residents. It's easier to shut people out if they don't fit the mold of the community housing provider. But Greg Oak made a point to me in a pub recently, not that he, spends much time in pubs, but he made a very interesting point. We've got this massive...
If I said attitude.
Oh, sorry, mate. That wasn't heckling. Well, you've had this massive expansion of high-rise development in Melbourne, but who cleans those buildings? Who cleans those toilets? Who comes in between 5 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning to hoover the hallways and hoover the rooms and clean the rooms? It's very, very low-paid people. Now, how are they going to get to work for the night shift? How are they going to get it to work for 7 o'clock in the morning if they're living in Craigieburn, if they're living in Cranbourne? They can't get in on time because of the crisis of public transport. Most of them don't have cars. So what the so-called not-for-profit community housing providers are doing is they're witch hunting out anyone who's got a job, anyone who's earning a quid, and they're trying to, anyone who's got a, sorry, the opposite, they're witch hunting out anybody who's come out of prison, anyone who shows any type of, social issues that they're not happy with. And they want to put in low-paid workers. They're like township workshops for low-paid workers where they stay there, live there, so they can get to work the next morning. That's the reality of community housing. But the most obvious thing that we face, apart from the high rents increase, the recent rent increases, is that on many of the estates in North Richmond, which is the biggest in Victoria, and Fitzroy, they want to sell off the parks that surround the high-rise estate, public housing land, and give it to property developers. We have to deconstruct that and say that what they're talking about is kids' playgrounds. Because if you live in the high-rise, you don't have a garden. Your garden is the park outside your public housing estate, outside your high-rise block. So what the government want to do, what Wendy Lovell wants to do, which by the way is just copying what Richard Wynne did in Carlton, it's not that she's made up, he did the heavy lifting, unfortunately, she's just carrying on, is take this land, flog it off to the likes of Becton or some other developer, put in yuppie apartments and sell it on the basis of social inclusion. Because wouldn't it be great if we had more yuppies on the estate? Then, bring business, jobs, what a load of codswallop, because we've seen in Carlton, they put literally a physical barrier between the private and the public, and that's exactly what they're going to do in Fitzroy and Richmond if they get away with it. The last point I want to make is that we're going to make it very hard for them to get away with. The meetings of the Sudanese community, of the Horn of Africa community, the Vietnamese, the Chinese, and all the peoples on the estates in Richmond and in Fitzroy have been unanimous in opposition to this sell-off. And if necessary, I know Robbie Thorpe is thinking that they will put up a sacred fire, we will occupy that land, we will copy from what Occupy Melbourne and Occupy Seattle did, and we will take physical possession of those parklands. Because the Sudanese women are not going to just roll over and let these developers and Wendy Lovell steal their land. Neither are any of the tenants in that estate. And I would appeal to you that in the new year, when these attacks start, we'll move from meetings like this, where we're educating each other about reality, to actually physical protest action on those two estates. And I formally invite you all to actively participate in that in 2013.